1. Why do the righteous suffer? There is only one question which really matters: why do bad things happen to good people? All other theological conversation is intellectually diverting, somewhat like doing the crossword puzzle in the Sunday paper, and feeling very satisfied when you have made the words fit, but ultimately without the capacity to reach people where they really care. Virtually every meaningful conversation I have ever had with people on the subject of God and religion has either started with this question, or gotten around to it before long. Not only the troubled man or woman who has just come from a discouraging diagnosis at the doctor's office, but the college student who tells me that he has decided there is no God, or the total stranger who comes up to me at a party just when I am ready to ask the hostess for my coat, and says, "I hear you're a rabbi, how can you believe that?" They all have one thing in common. They are all troubled by the unfair distribution of suffering in the world. The misfortunes of good people are not only a problem to the people who suffer and to their families. They are a problem to everyone who wants to believe in a just and fair and livable world. They inevitably raise questions about the goodness, the kindness, even the existence of God. I am the rabbi of a congregation of 600 families, or about 2,500 people. I visit them in the hospital, I officiate at their funerals. I try to help them through the wrenching pain of their divorces, their business failures, their unhappiness with their children. I sit and listen to them pour out their stories of terminally ill husbands or wives, of senile parents for whom a long life is a curse rather than a blessing, of seeing people whom they love contorted with pain or buried by frustration. And I find it very hard to tell them that life is fair, that God gives people what they deserve and need. Time after time, I have seen families and even whole communities unite in prayer for the recovery of a sick person, only to have their hopes and prayers mocked. I have seen the wrong people get sick, the wrong people be hurt, the wrong people die young. Like every reader of this book, I pick up the daily paper and fresh challenges to the idea of the world's goodness assault my eyes: senseless murders, fatal practical jokes, young people killed in automobile accidents on the way to their wedding or coming home from their high school prom. I add these stories to the personal tragedies I have known, and I have to ask myself, can I, in good faith, continue to teach people that the world is good, and that a kind and loving God is responsible for what happens in it? People don't have to be unusual, saintly human beings to make us confront this problem. We may not often find ourselves wondering, why do totally unselfish people suffer, people who never do anything wrong? Because we come to know very few such individuals. But we often find ourselves asking why ordinary people, nice friendly neighbors, neither extraordinarily good nor extraordinarily bad, should suddenly have to face the agony of pain and tragedy. If the world were fair, they would not seem to deserve it. They are neither very much better nor very much worse than most people we know. Why should their lives be so much harder? To ask, why do the righteous suffer, or why do bad things happen to good people, is not to limit our concern to the martyrdom of saints and sages, but to try to understand why ordinary people ourselves and people around us should have to bear extraordinary burdens of grief and pain. I was a young rabbi just starting out in my profession, when I was called on to try to help a family through an unexpected and almost unbearable tragedy. This middle-aged couple had one daughter, a bright 19-year-old girl who was in her freshman year at an out-of-state college. One morning at breakfast, they received a phone call from the university infirmary. "We have some bad news for you. Your daughter collapsed while walking to class this morning. It seems a blood vessel burst in her brain. She died before we could do anything for her. We're terribly sorry." Stunned, the parents asked a neighbor to come in to help them decide what steps to take next. The neighbor notified the synagogue, and I went over to see them that same day. I entered their home, feeling very inadequate, not knowing any words that could ease their pain. I anticipated anger, shock, grief, but I didn't expect to hear the first words they said to me. "You know, Rabbi, we didn't fast last Yom Kippur." Why did they say that? Why did they assume that they were somehow responsible for this tragedy? Who taught them to believe in a God who would strike down an attractive, gifted young woman without warning as punishment for someone else's ritual infraction? One of the ways in which people have tried to make sense of the world's suffering in every generation has been by assuming that we deserve what we get, that somehow our misfortunes come as punishment for our sins. Tell the righteous it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their deeds. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for what his hands have done shall be done to him. Isaiah 3:10, 11. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. Genesis 38:7. No ills befall the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. Proverbs 12:21. Consider, what innocent ever perished, or where have the righteous been destroyed? Job 14:7. This is an attitude we will meet later in the book when we discuss the whole question of guilt. It is tempting at one level to believe that bad things happen to people, especially other people, because God is a righteous judge who gives them exactly what they deserve. By believing that, we keep the world orderly and understandable. We give people the best possible reason for being good and for avoiding sin. And by believing that, we can maintain an image of God as all-loving, all-powerful, and totally in control. Given the reality of human nature, given the fact that none of us is perfect and that each of us can, without too much difficulty, think of things he has done which he should not have done, we can always find grounds for justifying what happens to us. But how comforting, how religiously adequate, is such an answer? The couple whom I tried to comfort, the parents who had lost their only child at age 19 with no warning, were not profoundly religious people. They were not active in the synagogue, they had not even fasted on Yom Kippur, a tradition which even many otherwise non-observant Jews maintain. But when they were stunned by tragedy, they reverted back to the basic belief that God punishes people for their sins. They sat there feeling that their daughter's death had been their fault. Had they been less selfish and less lazy about the Yom Kippur fast some 6 months earlier, she might still be alive. They sat there angry at God for having exacted his pound of flesh so strictly, but afraid to admit their anger for fear that he would punish them again. Life had hurt them, and religion could not comfort them. Religion was making them feel worse. The idea that God gives people what they deserve, that our misdeeds cause our misfortune, is a neat and attractive solution to the problem of evil. At several levels, but it has a number of serious limitations. As we have seen, it teaches people to blame themselves. It creates guilt even where there is no basis for guilt. It makes people hate God, even as it makes them hate themselves. And most disturbing of all, it does not even fit the facts. Perhaps if we had lived before the era of mass communications, we could have believed this thesis, as many intelligent people of those centuries did. It was easier to believe then. You needed to ignore fewer cases of bad things happening to good people. Without newspapers and television, without history books, you could shrug off the occasional death of a child or of a saintly neighbor. We know too much about the world to do that today. How can anyone who recognizes the names Auschwitz and My Lai, or has walked the corridors of hospitals and nursing homes, dare to answer the question of the world's suffering by quoting Isaiah, "Tell the righteous it shall be well with them"? To believe that today, a person would either have to deny the facts that press upon him from every side, or else define what he means by righteous in order to fit the inescapable facts. We would have to say that a righteous person was anyone who lived long and well, whether or not he was honest and charitable, and a wicked person was anyone who suffered, even if that person's life was otherwise commendable. A true story, an 11-year-old boy of my acquaintance was given a routine eye examination at school and found to be just nearsighted enough to require glasses. No one was terribly surprised at the news. His parents both wear glasses, as does his older sister. But for some reason, the boy was deeply upset at the prospect, and would not tell anyone why. Finally, one night as his mother was putting him to bed, the story came out. A week before the eye examination, the boy and 2 older friends were looking through a pile of trash that a neighbor had set out for collection, and found a copy of the magazine Playboy. With a sense that they were doing something naughty, they spent several minutes looking at the pictures of unclothed women. When, a few days later, the boy failed the eye test at school and was found to need glasses, he jumped to the conclusion that God had begun the process of punishing him with blindness for looking at those pictures. Sometimes we try to make sense of life's trials by saying that people do in fact get what they deserve, but only over the course of time. At any given moment, life may seem unfair and innocent people may appear to be suffering. But if we wait long enough, we believe, we will see the righteousness of God's plan emerge. So, for example, the 92nd Psalm praises God for the wonderful, flawlessly righteous world He has given us, and hints that foolish people find fault with it because they are impatient and don't give God the time it takes for His justice to emerge. How great are your deeds, O Lord! Your thoughts are very deep. The ignorant man does not comprehend them, nor does the fool understand them. When the wicked spring up like grass, and workers of iniquity flourish, it is that they may be destroyed forever. The righteous shall flourish like the palm tree, and grow mighty like a cedar of Lebanon. To declare that the Lord is upright, my rock in whom there is no unrighteousness. Psalm 92:6, 8, 13, 16. The psalmist wants to explain the world's apparent evil as in no way compromising God's justice and righteousness. He does it by comparing the wicked to grass, and the righteous to a palm tree or cedar. If you plant grass seed and a palm tree seed on the same day, the grass will start to sprout much sooner. At that point, a person who knew nothing about nature might predict that the grass would ultimately grow to be higher and stronger than the palm tree, since it was growing faster. But the experienced observer would know that the head start of the grass was only temporary, that it would wither and die in a few months, while the tree would grow slowly, but would grow to be tall and straight and would last for more than a generation. So too, the psalmist suggests, foolish impatient people see the prosperity of the wicked and the suffering of the upright, and jump to the conclusion that it pays to be wicked. Let them observe the situation over the long run. He notes, and they will see the wicked wither like the grass, and the righteous prosper slowly but surely, like the palm tree or cedar. If I could meet the author of the 92nd Psalm, I would first congratulate him on having composed a masterpiece of devotional literature. I would acknowledge that he has said something perceptive and important about the world we live in, that being dishonest and unscrupulous often gives people a head start, but that justice catches up to them. As Rabbi Milton Steinberg has written, consider the pattern of human affairs, how falsehood, having no legs, cannot stand, how evil tends to destroy itself, how every tyranny has eventually invoked its own doom. Now set against this the staying power of truth and righteousness. Could the contrast be so sharp unless something in the scheme of things discouraged evil and favored the good? Anatomy of faith. But having said that, I would be obliged to point out that there is a lot of wishful thinking in his theology. Even if I were to grant that wicked people don't get away with their wickedness, that they pay for it in one way or another, I cannot say amen to his claim that the righteous flourish like the palm tree. The psalmist would have us believe that, given enough time, the righteous will catch up and surpass the wicked in attaining the good things of life. How does he explain the fact that God, who is presumably behind this arrangement, does not always give the righteous man time to catch up? Some good people die unfulfilled, others find length of days to be more of a punishment than a privilege. The world, alas, is not so neat a place as the psalmist would have us believe. I think of an acquaintance of mine who built up a modestly successful business through many years of hard work, only to be driven into bankruptcy when he was cheated by a man he had trusted. I can tell him that the victory of evil over good is only temporary, that the other person's evil ways will catch up to him. But in the meantime, my acquaintance is a tired, frustrated man, no longer young, and grown cynical about the world. Who will send his children to college? Who will pay the medical bills that go with advancing age, during the years it takes for God's justice to catch up with him? No matter how much I would like to believe, with Milton Steinberg, that justice will ultimately emerge, can I guarantee that he will live long enough to see himself vindicated? I find I cannot share the optimism of the psalmist that the righteous, in the long run, will flourish like the palm tree and give testimony to God's uprightness. Often, victims of misfortune try to console themselves with the idea that God has his reasons for making this happen to them, reasons that they are in no position to judge. I think of a woman I know named Helen. The trouble started when Helen noticed herself getting tired after walking several blocks or standing in line. She chalked it up to getting older and having put on some weight. But one night, coming home after dinner with friends, Helen stumbled over the threshold of the front door, sent a lamp crashing to the floor, and fell to the floor herself. Her husband tried to joke about her getting drunk on 2 sips of wine, but Helen suspected that it was no joking matter. The following morning, she made an appointment to see a doctor. The diagnosis was multiple sclerosis. The doctor explained that it was a degenerative nerve disease, and that it would gradually get worse, maybe quickly, maybe gradually over many years. At some point Helen would find it harder to walk without support. Eventually she would be confined to a wheelchair, lose bowel and bladder control, and become more and more of an invalid until she died. The worst of Helen's fears had come true. She broke down and cried when she heard that. Why should this happen to me? I've tried to be a good person. I have a husband and young children who need me. I don't deserve this. Why should God make me suffer like this? Her husband took her hand and tried to console her. You can't talk like that. God must have his reasons for doing this, and it's not for us to question him. You have to believe that if he wants you to get better, you will get better, and if he doesn't, there has to be some purpose to it. Helen tried to find peace and strength in those words. She wanted to be comforted by the knowledge that there was some purpose to her suffering, beyond her capacity to understand. She wanted to believe that it made sense. At some level, all her life, she had been taught at religious school and in science classes alike that the world made sense, that everything that happened for a reason. She wanted so desperately to go on believing that, to hold on to her belief that God was in charge of things. Because if he wasn't, who was? It was hard to live with multiple sclerosis. But it was even harder to live with the idea that things happened to people for no reason, that God had lost touch with the world and nobody was in the driver's seat. Helen didn't want to question God or be angry at him. But her husband's words only made her feel more abandoned and more bewildered. What kind of higher purpose could possibly justify what she would have to face? How could this in any way be good? Much as she tried not to be angry at God, she felt angry, hurt, betrayed. She had been a good person, not perfect, perhaps, but honest, hard-working, helpful, as good as most people and better than many who were walking around healthy. What reasons could God possibly have for doing this to her? And on top of it all, she felt guilty for being angry at God. She felt alone in her fear and suffering. If God had sent her this affliction, if he, for some reason, wanted her to suffer, how could she ask him to cure her of it? In 1924 the novelist Thornton Wilder attempted to confront this question of questions in his novel The Bridge of San Luis Rey. One day in a small town in Peru, a rope bridge over a chasm breaks and the 5 people who are crossing the bridge fall to their deaths. A young Catholic priest happens to be watching, and is troubled by the event. Was it sheer accident, or was it somehow God's will that those 5 people should die that way? He investigates their life stories, and comes to an enigmatic conclusion. All 5 had recently resolved a problematic situation in their lives and were now about to enter a new phase. Perhaps it was an appropriate time for each of them to die, thinks the priest. I confess that I find that answer ultimately unsatisfying. For Wilder's 5 pedestrians on a rope bridge, let us substitute 250 passengers on an airplane that crashes. It strains the imagination to claim that every single one of them had just passed a point of resolution in his life. The human interest stories in the newspapers after a plane crash seem to indicate the opposite, that many of the victims were in the middle of important work, that many left young families and unfulfilled plans. In a novel, where the author's imagination can control the facts. Sudden tragedies can happen to people when the plot calls for it. But experience has taught me that real life is not all that neat. It may be that Thornton Wilder came to that conclusion himself. More than 40 years after writing The Bridge of San Luis Rey, an older and wiser Wilder returned to the question of why good people suffer in another novel, The Eighth Day. The book tells the story of a good and decent man whose life is ruined by bad luck and hostility. He and his family suffer although they are innocent. At the end of the novel, where the reader would hope for a happy ending, with heroes rewarded and villains punished, there is none. Instead, Wilder offers us the image of a beautiful tapestry. Looked at from the right side, it is an intricately woven work of art, drawing together threads of different lengths and colors to make up an inspiring picture. But turn the tapestry over, and you will see a hodgepodge of many threads. Some short and some long, some smooth, and some cut and knotted, going off in different directions. Wilder offers this as his explanation of why good people have to suffer in this life. God has a pattern into which all of our lives fit. His pattern requires that some lives be twisted, knotted, or cut short, while others extend to impressive lengths, not because one thread is more deserving than another, but simply because the pattern requires it. Looked at from underneath, from our vantage point in life, God's pattern of reward and punishment seems arbitrary and without design, like the underside of a tapestry. But looked at from outside this life, from God's vantage point, every twist and knot is seen to have its place in a great design that adds up to a work of art. There is much that is moving in this suggestion, and I can imagine that many people would find it comforting. Pointless suffering, suffering as punishment for some unspecified sin, is hard to bear. But suffering as a contribution to a great work of art designed by God Himself may be seen not only as a tolerable burden, but even as a privilege. So one victim of medieval misfortune is supposed to have prayed, "Tell me not why I must suffer. Assure me only that I suffer for thy sake." On closer examination, however, this approach is found wanting. For all its compassion, it too is based in large measure on wishful thinking. The crippling illness of a child, the death of a young husband and father, the ruin of an innocent person through malicious gossip, these are all real. We have seen them. But nobody has seen Wilder's tapestry. All he can say to us is, imagine that there might be such a tapestry. I find it very hard to accept hypothetical solutions to real problems. How seriously would we take a person who said, "I have faith in Adolf Hitler, or in John Dillinger. I can't explain why they did the things they did. But I can't believe they would have done them without a good reason." Yet, people try to justify the deaths and tragedies God inflicts on innocent victims with almost these same words. Furthermore, my religious commitment to the supreme value of an individual life makes it hard for me to accept an answer that is not scandalized by an innocent person's pain, that condones human pain, because it supposedly contributes to an overall work of aesthetic value. If a human artist or employer made children suffer so that something immensely impressive or valuable could come to pass, we would put him in prison. Why then should we excuse God for causing such undeserved pain? No matter how wonderful the ultimate result may be. Helen, contemplating a life of physical pain and mental anguish, finds that her illness has robbed her of her childhood faith in God and in the goodness of the world. She challenges her family, her friends, her clergyman, to explain why such a terrible thing should happen to her, or for that matter to anyone. If there really is a God, says Helen, she hates him, and hates whatever grand design caused him to inflict such misery on her. Let us now consider another question: can suffering be educational? Can it cure us of our faults and make us better people? Sometimes religious people who would like to believe that God has good reasons for making us suffer, try to imagine what those reasons might be. In the words of one of the great Orthodox Jewish teachers of our time, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, suffering comes to a noble man, to purge his thoughts of pride and superficiality, to expand his horizons. In sum, the purpose of suffering is to repair that which is faulty in a man's personality. Just as a parent sometimes has to punish a child whom he loves, for the child's sake, so God has to punish us. A parent who pulls his child out of a busy roadway, or refuses to give him a candy bar before supper, is not being mean or punitive or unfair. He or she is just being a concerned, responsible parent. Sometimes a parent even has to punish a child with a spanking or a deprivation in order to drive home a lesson. The child may feel that he is being arbitrarily deprived of something all the other children have, and he may wonder why an ostensibly loving parent should treat him that way, but that is because he is still a child. When he grows up, he will come to understand the wisdom and necessity of it. Similarly, we are told, God treats us the way a wise and caring parent treats a naive child, keeping us from hurting ourselves, withholding something we may think we want, punishing us occasionally to make sure we understand that we have done something seriously wrong, and patiently enduring our temper tantrums at his unfairness in the confidence that we will one day mature and understand that it was all for our own good. For whom the Lord loves, he chastises, even as a father does to the son he loves. Proverbs 3:12. The newspapers recently carried the story of a woman who had spent 6 years traveling around the world buying antiques, preparing to set up a business. A week before she was ready to open, a wayward bolt of lightning set off an electrical fire in a block of stores, and several shops, including hers, were burned down. The goods, being priceless and irreplaceable, were insured for only a fraction of their value. And what insurance settlement could compensate a middle-aged woman for 6 years of her life spent in searching and collecting? The poor woman was distraught. Why did this have to happen? Why did it happen to me? One friend, trying to console her, was quoted as saying, "Maybe God is trying to teach you a lesson. Maybe he is trying to tell you that he doesn't want you to be rich. He doesn't want you to be a successful businesswoman, caught up in profit and loss statements all day long and annual trips to the Far East to buy things. He wants you to put your energies into something else," and this was his way of getting his message across to you. A contemporary teacher has used this image: if a man who knew nothing about medicine were to walk into the operating room of a hospital and see doctors and nurses performing an operation, he might assume that they were a band of criminals torturing their unfortunate victim. He would see them tying the patient down, forcing a cone over his nose and mouth so that he could not breathe, and sticking knives and needles into him. Only someone who understood surgery would realize that they were doing all this to help the patient, not to torment him. So too, it is suggested, God does painful things to us as his way of helping us. Consider the case of Ron, a young pharmacist who ran a drugstore with an older partner. When Ron bought into the business, his older colleague told him that the store had recently been the target of a series of holdups by young drug addicts looking for drugs and cash. One day, when Ron was almost ready to close up, a teenage junkie pulled a small caliber handgun on him and asked for drugs and money. Ron was willing to lose a day's receipts rather than try to be a hero. He went to open the cash register, his hands trembling as he did so. As he turned, he stumbled and reached for the counter to brace himself. The robber thought he was going for a gun, and fired. The bullet went through Ron's abdomen and lodged in his spinal cord. Doctors removed it, but the damage had been done. Ron would never walk again. Friends tried to console him. Some held his hand and commiserated with him. Some told him of experimental drugs doctors were using on paraplegics, or of miraculous spontaneous recoveries they had read about. Others tried to help him understand what had happened to him, and to answer his question, "Why me?" "I have to believe," one friend said, "that everything that happens in life happens for a purpose. Somehow or other, everything that happens to us is meant for our good. Look at it this way. You were always a pretty cocky guy, popular with girls, flashy cars, confident you were going to make a lot of money. You never really took time to worry about the people who couldn't keep up with you. Maybe this is God's way of teaching you a lesson, making you more thoughtful, more sensitive to others. Maybe this is God's way of purging you of pride and arrogance, and thinking about how You were going to be such a success. It's his way of making you a better, more sensitive person. The friend wanted to be comforting, to make sense of this senseless accident. But if you were Ron, what would your reaction have been? Ron remembers thinking that if he hadn't been confined to a hospital bed, he would have punched the other man. What right did a normal, healthy person, a person who would soon be driving home, walking upstairs, looking forward to playing tennis, have to tell him that what had happened to him was good and was in his best interests? The problem with a line of reasoning like this one is that it isn't really meant to help the sufferer or to explain his suffering. It is meant primarily to defend God, to use words and ideas to transform bad into good and pain into privilege. Such answers are thought up by people who believe very strongly that God is a loving parent who controls what happens to us, and on the basis of that belief adjust and interpret the facts to fit their assumption. It may be true that surgeons stick knives into people to help them, but not everyone who sticks a knife into somebody else is a surgeon. It may be true that sometimes we have to do painful things to people we love for their benefit, but not every painful thing that happens to us is beneficial. I would find it easier to believe that I experience tragedy and suffering in order to repair that which is faulty in my personality if there were some clear connection between the fault and the punishment. A parent who disciplines a child for doing something wrong, but never tells him what he is being punished for, is hardly a model of responsible parenthood. Yet, those who explain suffering as God's way of teaching us to change are at a loss to specify just what it is about us we are supposed to change. Equally unhelpful would be the explanation that Ron's accident happened not to make him a more sensitive person, but to make his friends and family more sensitive to the handicapped than they would otherwise have been. Perhaps women give birth to dwarfed or retarded children as part of God's plan to deepen and enlarge their souls, to teach them compassion and a different kind of love. We have all read stories of little children who were left unwatched for just a moment and fell from a window or into a swimming pool and died. Why does God permit such a thing to happen to an innocent child? It can't be to teach a child a lesson about exploring new areas. By the time the lesson is over, the child is dead. Is it to teach the parents and babysitters to be more careful? That is too trivial a lesson to be purchased at the price of a child's life. Is it to make the parents more sensitive, more compassionate people, more appreciative of life and health because of their experience? Is it to move them to work for better safety standards, and in that way save 100 future lives? The price is still too high, and the reasoning shows too little regard for the value of an individual life. I am offended by those who suggest that God creates retarded children so that those around them will learn compassion and gratitude. Why should God distort someone else's life to such a degree in order to enhance my spiritual sensitivity? If we cannot satisfactorily explain suffering by saying we deserve what we get, or by viewing it as a cure for our faults, can we accept the interpretation of tragedy as a test? Many parents of dying children are urged to read the 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis to help them understand and accept their burden. In that chapter, God orders Abraham to take his son Isaac, whom he loves, and offer him to God as a human sacrifice. The chapter begins with the words, "It came to pass after all these matters that the Lord tested Abraham." God had Abraham go through that ordeal to test his loyalty and the strength of his faith. When he passed the test, God promised to reward him liberally for the strength he had shown. For those who have difficulty with the notion of a God who plays such sadistic games with his most faithful follower, proponents of this view explain that God knows how the story will end. He knows that we will pass the test, as Abraham did, with our faith intact, though, in Abraham's case, the child did not die. He puts us to the test so that we will discover how strong and faithful we are. The Talmud, the compilation of the teachings of the rabbis between the years 200 BC and AD 500, explains Abraham's test this way: if you go to the marketplace, you will see the potter hitting his clay pots with a stick to show how strong and solid they are. But the wise potter hits only the strongest pots, never the flawed ones. So too, God sends such tests and afflictions only to people he knows are capable of handling them, so that they and others can learn the extent of their spiritual strength. I was the parent of a handicapped child for 14 years, until his death. I was not comforted by this notion that God had singled me out because He recognized some special spiritual strength within me and knew that I would be able to handle it better. It didn't make me feel privileged, nor did it help me understand why God has to send handicapped children into the lives of 100,000 unsuspecting families every year. Writer Harriet Sarnoff Schiff has distilled her pain and tragedy into an excellent book, The Bereaved Parent. She remembers that when her young son died during an operation to correct a congenital heart malfunction, her clergyman took her aside and said, "I know that this is a painful time for you. But I know that you will get through it all right, because God never sends us more of a burden than we can bear. God only let this happen to you because He knows that you are strong enough to handle it." Harriet Schiff remembers her reaction to those words, "If only I was a weaker person, Robbie would still be alive." Does God temper the wind to the shorn lamb? Does He never ask more of us than we can endure? My experience, alas, has been otherwise. I have seen people crack under the strain of unbearable tragedy. I have seen marriages break up after the death of a child, because parents blamed each other for not taking proper care or for carrying the defective gene, or simply because the memories they shared were unendurably painful. I have seen some people made noble and sensitive through suffering, but I have seen many more people grow cynical and bitter. I have seen people become jealous of those around them, unable to take part in the routines of normal living. I have seen cancers and automobile accidents take the life of one member of a family, and functionally end the lives of 5 others, who could never again be the normal, cheerful people they were before disaster struck. If God is testing us, He must know by now that many of us fail the test. If He is only giving us burdens we can bear, I have seen Him miscalculate far too often. When all else fails, some people try to explain suffering by believing that it comes to liberate us from a world of pain and lead us to a better place. I received a phone call one day informing me that a 5-year-old boy in our neighborhood had run out into the street after a ball had been hit by a car and killed. I didn't know the boy, his family was not part of the congregation, but several children from the congregation had known him and played with him. Their mothers attended the funeral, and some of them told me about it afterwards. In the eulogy, the family's clergyman had said, "This is not a time for sadness or tears. This is a time for rejoicing, because Michael has been taken out of this world of sin and pain with his innocent soul unstained by sin. He is in a happier land now where there is no pain and no grief. Let us thank God for that." I heard that, and I felt so bad for Michael's parents. Not only had they lost a child without warning, they were being told by the representative of their religion that they should rejoice in the fact that he had died so young and so innocent, and I couldn't believe that they felt much like rejoicing at that moment. They felt hurt, they felt angry, they felt that God had been unfair to them, and here was God's spokesman telling them to be grateful to God for what had happened. Sometimes in our reluctance to admit that there is unfairness in the world, we try to persuade ourselves that what has happened is not really bad. We only think that it is. It is only our selfishness that makes us cry because 5-year-old Michael is with God instead of living with us. Sometimes, in our cleverness, we try to persuade ourselves that what we call evil is not real, does not really exist, but is only a condition of not enough goodness. Even as cold means not enough heat, or darkness is a name we give to the absence of light. We may thus prove that there is really no such thing as darkness or cold, but people do stumble and hurt themselves because of the dark, and people do die of exposure to cold. Their deaths and injuries are no less real because of our verbal cleverness. Sometimes, because our souls yearn for justice, because we so desperately want to believe that God will be fair to us, we fasten our hopes on the idea that life in this world is not the only reality. Somewhere beyond this life is another world where the last shall be first, and those whose lives were cut short here on earth will be reunited with those they loved, and will spend eternity with them. Neither I nor any other living person can know anything about the reality of that hope. We know that our physical bodies decay after we die. I for one believe that the part of us which is not physical, the part we call the soul or personality, does not and cannot die. But I am not capable of imagining what a soul without a body looks like. Will we be able to recognize disembodied souls as being the people we had known and loved? Will a man who lost his father at a young age, and then lived a full life, be older, younger, or the same age as his father in the world to come? Will the souls of the retarded or the short-tempered be somehow made whole in heaven? People who have been close to death and recovered tell of seeing a bright light and being greeted by someone they had loved, now deceased. After our son's death, our daughter dreamed that she had died and was welcomed into heaven by her brother, now grown normal, and by her grandmother, who had died the year before. Needless to say, we have no way of knowing whether these visions are intimations of reality or products of our own wishful thinking. Belief in a world to come where the innocent are compensated for their suffering can help people endure the unfairness of life in this world without losing faith. But it can also be an excuse for not being troubled or outraged by injustice around us, and not using our God-given intelligence to try to do something about it. The dictate of practical wisdom for people in our situation might be to remain mindful of the possibility that our lives continue in some form after death, perhaps in a form our earthly imaginations cannot conceive of. But at the same time, since we cannot know for sure, we would be well advised to take this world as seriously as we can, in case it turns out to be the only one we will ever have, and to look for meaning and justice here. All the responses to tragedy which we have considered have at least one thing in common. They all assume that God is the cause of our suffering. And they try to understand why God would want us to suffer. Is it for our own good, or is it a punishment we deserve, or could it be that God does not care what happens to us? Many of the answers were sensitive and imaginative, but none was totally satisfying. Some led us to blame ourselves in order to spare God's reputation. Others asked us to deny reality, or to repress our true feelings. We were left either hating ourselves for deserving such a fate, or hating God for sending it to us when we did not deserve it. There may be another approach. Maybe God does not cause our suffering. Maybe it happens for some reason other than the will of God. The psalmist writes, "I lift mine eyes to the hills, from where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth." Psalm 121:1, 2. He does not say, "My pain comes from the Lord," or "My tragedy comes from the Lord." He says, "My help comes from the Lord." Could it be that God does not cause the bad things that happen to us? Could it be that He doesn't decide which families shall give birth to a handicapped child, that He did not single out Ron to be crippled by a bullet, or Helen by a degenerative disease, but rather that He stands ready to help them and us cope with our tragedies if we could only get beyond the feelings of guilt and anger that separate us from Him? Could it be that "How could God do this to me?" is really the wrong question for us to ask? The most profound and complete consideration of human suffering in the Bible, perhaps in all of literature. 2. The story of a man named Job. About 2,500 years ago, a man lived whose name we will never know, but who has enriched the minds and lives of human beings ever since. He was a sensitive man who saw good people getting sick and dying around him while proud and selfish people prospered. He heard all the learned, clever, and pious attempts to explain life, and he was as dissatisfied with them as we are today. Because he was a person of rare literary and intellectual gifts, he wrote a long philosophical poem on the subject of why God lets bad things happen to good people. This poem appears in the Bible as the Book of Job. Thomas Carlyle called the Book of Job the most wonderful poem of any age and language, our first, oldest statement of the never-ending problem: man's destiny and God's way with him here in this earth. There is nothing written in the Bible or out of it of equal literary merit. I have been fascinated by the Book of Job ever since I learned of its existence, and have studied it, reread it, and taught it any number of times. It has been said that just as every actor yearns to play Hamlet, every Bible student yearns to write a commentary on the Book of Job. It is a hard book to understand, Profound and beautiful book on the most profound of subjects, the question of why God lets good people suffer. Its argument is hard to follow because, through some of the characters, the author presents views he himself probably did not accept, and because he wrote in an elegant Hebrew which, thousands of years later, is often hard to translate. If you compare two English translations of Job, you may wonder if they are both translations of the same book. One of the key verses can be taken to mean either I will fear God or I will not fear God, and there is no way of knowing for sure what the author intended. The familiar statement of faith, I know that my Redeemer lives, may mean instead, I would rather be redeemed while I am still alive. But much of the book is clear and forceful, and we can try our interpretive skills on the rest. Who was Job, and what is the book that bears his name? A long, long time ago, scholars believe, there must have been a well-known folk story, a kind of morality fable told to reinforce people's religious sentiments, about a pious man named Job. Job was so good, so perfect, that you realize it once that you are not reading about a real-life person. This is a once upon a time story about a good man who suffered. One day, the story goes, Satan appears before God to tell him about all the sinful things people were doing on earth. God says to Satan, "Did you notice my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, a thoroughly good man who never sins." Satan answers God, "Of course Job is pious and obedient. You make it worth his while, showering riches and blessings on him. Take away those blessings and see how long he remains your obedient servant." God accepts Satan's challenge. Without in any way telling Job what is going on, God destroys Job's house and cattle and kills his children. He afflicts Job with boils all over his body, so that his every moment becomes physical torture. Job's wife urges him to curse God, even if that means God's striking him dead. He can't do anything worse to Job than he already has done. 3 friends come to console Job, and they too urge him to give up his piety, if this is the reward it brings him. But Job remains steadfast in his faith. Nothing that happens to him can make him give up his devotion to God. At the end, God appears, scolds the friends for their advice, and rewards Job for his faithfulness. God gives him a new home, a new fortune, and new children. The moral of the story is, when hard times befall you, don't be tempted to give up your faith in God. He has his reasons for what he is doing, and if you hold on to your faith long enough, he will compensate you for your suffering. Over the generations, many people must have been told that story. Some, no doubt, were comforted by it. Others were shamed into keeping their doubts and complaints to themselves after hearing Job's example. Our anonymous author was bothered by it. What kind of God would that story have us believe in, who would kill innocent children and visit unbearable anguish on his most devoted follower in order to prove a point, in order, we almost feel, to win a bet with Satan? What kind of religion is the story urging on us, which delights in blind obedience and calls it sinful to protest against injustice? He was so upset with this pious old fable that he took it, turned it inside out, and recast it as a philosophical poem in which the characters' positions are reversed. In the poem, Job does complain against God, and now it is the friends who uphold the conventional theology, the idea that no ills befall the righteous. In an effort to comfort Job, whose children have died and who is suffering from the boils, the 3 friends say all the traditional, pious things. In essence, they preach the point of view contained in the original Job fable. Don't lose faith, despite these calamities. We have a loving Father in heaven, and he will see to it that the good prosper and the wicked are punished. Job, who has probably spoken these same words innumerable times to other mourners, realizes for the first time how hollow and offensive they are. What do you mean, he will see to it that the good prosper and the wicked are punished? Are you implying that my children were wicked and that is why they died? Are you saying that I am wicked, and that is why all this is happening to me? Where was I so terrible? What did I do that was so much worse than anything you did, that I should suffer so much worse a fate? The friends are startled by this outburst. They respond by saying that a person can't expect God to tell him what he is being punished for. At one point, one of the friends says, in effect, "What do you want from God? An itemized report about every time you told a lie or ignored a beggar. God is too busy running a world to invite you to go over his records with him." We can only assume that nobody is perfect, and that God knows what he is doing. If we don't assume that, the world becomes chaotic and unlivable. And so that argument continues. Job doesn't claim to be perfect, but says that he has tried, more than most people, to live a good and decent life. How can God be a loving God if he is constantly spying on people, ready to pounce on any imperfection in an otherwise good record, and use that to justify punishment? And how can God be a just God if so many wicked people are not punished as horribly as Job is? The dialogue becomes heated, even angry. The friends say, "Job, you really had us fooled. You gave us the impression that you were as pious and religious as we are. But now we see how you throw religion overboard the first time something unpleasant happens to you. You are proud, arrogant, impatient, and blasphemous. No wonder God is doing this to you. It just proves our point that human beings can be fooled as to who is a saint and who is a sinner, but you can't fool God." After 3 cycles of dialogue in which we alternately witness Job voicing his complaints and the friends defending God, the book comes to its thunderous climax. The author brilliantly has Job make use of a principle of biblical criminal law. If a man is accused of wrongdoing without proof, he may take an oath, swearing to his innocence. At that point, the accuser must either come up with evidence against him or drop the charges. In a long and eloquent statement that takes up chapters 29 and 30 of the biblical book, Job swears to his innocence. He claims that he never neglected the poor, never took anything that did not belong to him, never boasted of his wealth, or rejoiced in his enemy's misfortune. He challenges God to appear with evidence, or to admit that Job is right and has suffered wrongly. And God appears. There comes a terrible windstorm out of the desert, and God answers Job out of the whirlwind. Job's case is so compelling, his challenge so forceful, that God himself comes down to earth to answer him. But God's answer is hard to understand. He doesn't talk about Job's case at all, neither to detail Job's sins nor to explain his suffering. Instead, he says to Job, in effect, "What do you know about how to run a world? Where were you when I planned the earth? Tell me, if you are wise. Do you know who took its dimensions, measuring its length with a cord? Were you there when I stopped the sea and set its boundaries, saying, 'Here you may come, but no further'? Have you seen where the snow is stored, or visited the storehouse of the hail? Do you tell the antelope when to calve? Do you give the horse his strength? Do you show the hawk how to fly?" Job 38:39. And now a very different Job answers, saying, "I put my hand to my mouth. I have said too much already, now I will speak no more." The book of Job is probably the greatest, fullest, most profound discussion of the subject of good people suffering ever written. Part of its greatness lies in the fact that the author was scrupulously fair to all points of view, even those he did not accept. Though his sympathies are clearly with Job, he makes sure that the speeches of the friends are as carefully thought out and as carefully written as are his hero's words. That makes for great literature, but it also makes it hard to understand his message. When God says, "How dare you challenge the way I run my world? What do you know about running a world?" Is that supposed to be the last word on the subject? Or is that just one more paraphrase of the conventional piety of that time? To try to understand the book and its answer, let us take note of 3 statements which everyone in the book, and most of the readers, would like to be able to believe. God is all-powerful and causes everything that happens in the world. Nothing happens without his willing it. God is just and fair, and stands for people getting what they deserve, so that the good prosper and the wicked are punished. Job is a good person. As long as Job is healthy and wealthy, we can believe all 3 of those statements at the same time with no difficulty. When Job suffers, when he loses his possessions, his family, and his health, we have a problem. We can no longer make sense of all 3 propositions together. We can now affirm any two only by denying the third. If God is both just and powerful, then Job must be a sinner who deserves what is happening to him. If Job is good but God causes his suffering anyway, then God is not just. If Job deserved better and God did not send his suffering, then God is not all-powerful. We can see the argument of the Book of Job as an argument over which of the three statements we are prepared to sacrifice, so that we can keep on believing in the other two. Job's friends are prepared to stop believing in, the assertion that Job is a good person. They want to believe in God as they have been taught to. They want to believe that God is good and that God is in control of things. And the only way they can do that is to convince themselves that Job deserves what is happening to him. They start out truly wanting to comfort Job and make him feel better. They try to reassure him by quoting all the maxims of faith and confidence on which they and Job alike were raised. They want to comfort Job by telling him that the world does in fact make sense, that it is not a chaotic, meaningless place. What they do not realize is that they can only make sense of the world, and of Job's suffering, by deciding that he deserves what he has gone through. To say that everything works out in God's world may be comforting to the casual bystander, but it is an insult to the bereaved and the unfortunate. Cheer up, Job, nobody ever gets anything he doesn't have coming to him is not a very cheering message to someone in Job's circumstances. But it is hard for the friends to say anything else. They believe, and want to continue believing, in God's goodness and power. But if Job is innocent, then God must be guilty of making an innocent man suffer. With that at stake, they find it easier to stop believing in Job's goodness than to stop believing in God's perfection. It may also be that Job's comforters could not be objective about what had happened to their friend. Their thinking may have been confused by their own reactions of guilt and relief that these misfortunes had befallen Job and not them. There is a German psychological term, Schadenfreude, which refers to the embarrassing reaction of relief we feel when something bad happens to someone else instead of to us. The soldier in combat who sees his friend killed 20 yards away while he himself is unhurt, the pupil who sees another child get into trouble for copying on a test they don't wish their friends ill, but they can't help feeling an embarrassing spasm of gratitude that it happened to someone else and not to them. Like the friends who tried to comfort Ron or Helen, they hear a voice inside them saying, "It could just as easily have been me," and they try to silence it by saying, "No, that's not true. There is a reason why it happened to him and not to me." We see this psychology at work elsewhere, blaming the victim so that evil doesn't seem quite so irrational and threatening. If the Jews had behaved differently, Hitler would not have been driven to murder them. If the young woman had not been so provocatively dressed, the man would not have assaulted her. If people worked harder, they would not be poor. If society did not taunt poor people by advertising things they cannot afford, they would not steal. Blaming the victim is a way of reassuring ourselves that the world is not as bad a place as it may seem, and that there are good reasons for people's suffering. It helps fortunate people believe that their good fortune is deserved, rather than being a matter of luck. It makes everyone feel better except the victim, who now suffers the double abuse of social condemnation on top of his original misfortune. This is the approach of Job's friends, and while it may solve their problem, it does not solve Job's, or ours. Job, for his part, is unwilling to hold the world together theologically by admitting that he is a villain. He knows a lot of things intellectually, but he knows one thing more deeply. Job is absolutely sure that he is not a bad person. He may not be perfect, but he is not so much worse than others, by any intelligible moral standard, that he should deserve to lose his home, his children, his wealth, and health while other people get to keep all those things. And he is not prepared to lie to save God's reputation. Job's solution is to reject proposition B, the affirmation of God's goodness. Job is in fact a good man, but God is so powerful that he is not limited by considerations of fairness and justice. A philosopher might put it this way: God may choose to be fair and give a person what he deserves, punishing the wicked and rewarding the righteous. But can we say logically that an all-powerful God must be fair? Would he still be all-powerful if we, by living virtuous lives, could compel him to protect and reward us? Or would he then be reduced to a kind of cosmic vending machine, into which we insert the right number of tokens and from which we get what we want, with the option of kicking and cursing the machine if it doesn't give us what we paid for? An ancient sage is said to have rejoiced at the world's injustice, saying, "Now I can do God's will out of love for him and not out of self-interest." That is, he could be a moral, obedient person out of sheer love for God, without the calculation that moral obedient people will be rewarded with good fortune. He could love God even if God did not love him in return. The problem with such an answer is that it tries to promote justice and fairness and at the same time tries to celebrate God for being so great that he is beyond the limitations of justice and fairness. Job sees God as being above notions of fairness, being so powerful that no moral rules apply to him. God is seen as resembling an oriental potentate, with unchallenged power over the life and property of his subjects. And in fact, the old fable of Job does picture God in just that way, as a deity who afflicts Job without any moral qualms in order to test his loyalty, and who feels that he has made it up to Job afterward by rewarding him lavishly. The God of the fable, held up as a figure to be worshipped for so many generations, is very much like an insecure, ancient king, rewarding people not for their goodness but for their loyalty. So Job constantly wishes that there were an umpire to mediate between himself and God, someone God would have to explain himself to. But when it comes to God, he ruefully admits, there are no rules. Behold, he snatches away, and who can hinder him? Who can say to him, "What are you doing?" Job 9:12. How does Job understand his misery? He says, "We live in an unjust world, from which we cannot expect fairness. There is a God, but he is free of the limitations of justice and righteousness." What about the anonymous author of the book? What is his answer to the riddle of life's unfairness? As indicated, it is hard to know just what he thought and what solution he had in mind when he set out to write his book. It seems clear that he has put his answer into God's mouth in the speech from the whirlwind, coming as it does at the climax of the book. But what does it mean? Is it simply that Job is silenced by finding out that there is a God, that there really is someone in charge up there? But Job never doubted that it was God's sympathy, accountability, and fairness that were at issue, not his existence. Is the answer that God is so powerful that he doesn't have to explain himself to Job? But that is precisely what Job has been claiming throughout the book. There is a God, and he is so powerful that he doesn't have to be fair. What new insight does the author bring by having God appear and speak, if that is all he has to say, and why is Job so apologetic if it turns out that God agrees with him? Is God saying, as some commentators suggest, that he has other considerations to worry about, besides the welfare of one individual human being, when he makes decisions that affect our lives? Is he saying that, from our human vantage point, our sicknesses and business failures are the most important things imaginable, but God has more on his mind than that? To say that is to say that the morality of the Bible, with its stress on human virtue and the sanctity of the individual life, is irrelevant to God, and that charity, justice, and the dignity of the individual human being have some source other than God. If that were true, many of us would be tempted to leave God, and seek out and worship that source of charity, justice, and human dignity instead. Let me suggest that the author of the book of Job takes the position which neither Job nor his friends take. He believes in God's goodness and in Job's goodness, and is prepared to give up his belief in proposition that God is all-powerful. Bad things do happen to good people in this world, but it is not God who wills it. God would like people to get what they deserve in life, but he cannot always arrange it. Forced to choose between a good God who is not totally powerful, or a powerful God who is not totally good, the author of the book of Job chooses to believe in God's goodness. The most important lines in the entire book may be the ones spoken by God in the second half of the speech from the whirlwind, chapter 40, verses 9 to 14. Have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like his? You tread down the wicked where they stand. Bury them in the dust together. Then will I acknowledge that your own right hand can give you victory. I take these lines to mean if you think that it is so easy to keep the world straight and true, to keep unfair things from happening to people, you try it. God wants the righteous to live peaceful, happy lives, but sometimes even He can't bring that about. It is too difficult even for God to keep cruelty and chaos from claiming their innocent victims. But could man, without God, do it better? The speech goes on, in chapter 41, to describe God's battle with the sea serpent Leviathan. With great effort, God is able to catch him in a net and pin him with fish hooks, but it is not easy. If the sea serpent is a symbol of chaos and evil, of all the uncontrollable things in the world, as it traditionally is in ancient mythology, the author may be saying there too that even God has a hard time keeping chaos in check and limiting the damage that evil can do. Innocent people do suffer misfortunes in this life. Things happen to them far worse than they deserve. They lose their jobs, they get sick, their children suffer or make them suffer. But when it happens, it does not represent God punishing them for something they did wrong. The misfortunes do not come from God at all. There may be a sense of loss at coming to this conclusion. In a way, it was comforting to believe in an all-wise, all-powerful God who guaranteed fair treatment and happy endings, who reassured us that everything happened for a reason, even as life was easier for us when we could believe that our parents were wise enough to know what to do and strong enough to make everything turn out right. But it was comforting the way the religion of Job's friends was comforting. It worked only as long as we did not take the problems of innocent victims seriously. When we have met Job, when we have been Job, we cannot believe in that sort of God any longer without giving up our own right to feel angry, to feel that we have been treated badly by life. From that perspective, there ought to be a sense of relief in coming to the conclusion that God is not doing this to us. If God is a God of justice and not of power, then He can still be on our side when bad things happen to us. He can know that we are good and honest people who deserve better. Our misfortunes are none of His doing, and so we can turn to Him for help. Our question will not be Job's question, God, why are you doing this to me? But rather, God, see what is happening to me. Can you help me? We will turn to God, not to be judged or forgiven, not to be rewarded or punished, but to be strengthened and comforted. If we have grown up, as Job and his friends did, believing in an all-wise, all-powerful, all-knowing God, it will be hard for us, as it was hard for them, to change our way of thinking about Him, as it was hard for us, when we were children, to realize that our parents were not all-powerful, that a broken toy had to be thrown out because they could not fix it, not because they did not want to. But if we can bring ourselves to acknowledge that there are some things God does not control, many good things become possible. We will be able to turn to God for things He can do to help us, instead of holding on to unrealistic expectations of Him which will never come about. The Bible, after all, repeatedly speaks of God as the special protector of the poor, the widow, and the orphan, without raising the question of how it happened that they became poor, widowed, or orphaned in the first place. We can maintain our own self-respect and sense of goodness without having to feel that God has judged us and condemned us. We can be angry at what has happened to us, without feeling that we are angry at God. More than that, we can recognize our anger at life's unfairness, our instinctive compassion at seeing people suffer, as coming from God who teaches us to be angry at injustice and to feel compassion for the afflicted. Instead of feeling that we are opposed to God, we can feel that our indignation is God's anger at unfairness working through us, that when we cry out, we are free. Sometimes there is no reason. If the bad things that happen to us are the results of bad luck, and not the will of God, a woman asked me one evening after I had delivered a lecture on my theology, what makes bad luck happen? I was stumped for an answer. My instinctive response was that nothing makes bad luck happen, it just happens. But I suspected that there must be more to it than that. This is perhaps the philosophical idea which is the key to everything else I am suggesting in this book. Can you accept the idea that some things happen for no reason, that there is randomness in the universe? Some people cannot handle that idea. They look for connections, striving desperately to make sense of all that happens. They convince themselves that God is cruel, or that they are sinners, rather than accept randomness. Sometimes, when they have made sense of 90% of everything they let themselves assume that the other 10% makes sense also, but lies beyond the reach of their understanding. But why do we have to insist on everything being reasonable? Why must everything happen for a specific reason? Why can't we let the universe have a few rough edges? I can more or less understand why a man's mind might suddenly snap, so that he grabs a shotgun and runs out into the street, shooting at strangers. Perhaps he is an army veteran, haunted by memories of things he has seen and done in combat. Perhaps he has encountered more frustration and rejection than he can bear at home and at work. He has been treated like a non-person, someone who does not have to be taken seriously, until his rage boils over and he decides, I'll show them that I matter after all. To grab a gun and shoot at innocent people is irrational, unreasonable behavior, but I can understand it. What I cannot understand is why Mrs. Smith should be walking on that street at that moment, while Mrs. Brown chooses to step into a shop on a whim and saves her life. Why should Mr. Jones happen to be crossing the street, presenting a perfect target to the mad marksman, while Mr. Green, who never has more than one cup of coffee for breakfast, chooses to linger over a second cup that morning and is still indoors when the shooting starts? The lives of dozens of people will be affected by such trivial, unplanned decisions. I understand that hot, dry weather, weeks without rain, increases the danger of forest fire, so that a spark, a match, or sunlight focused on a shard of glass can set a forest ablaze. I understand that the course of that fire will be determined by, among other things, the direction in which the wind blows. But is there a sensible explanation for why wind and weather combine to direct a forest fire on a given day toward certain homes rather than others, trapping some people inside and sparing others? Or is it just a matter of pure luck? When a man and a woman join in making love, the man's ejaculate swarms with tens of millions of sperm cells, each one carrying a slightly different set of biologically inherited characteristics. No moral intelligence decides which one of those teeming millions will fertilize a waiting egg. Some of the sperm cells will cause a child to be born with a physical handicap, perhaps a fatal malady. Others will give him not only good health, but superior athletic or musical ability, or creative intelligence. A child's life will be wholly shaped, the lives of parents and relatives will be deeply affected by the random determination of that race. Sometimes many more lives may be affected. Robert and Suzanne Massey, parents of a boy with hemophilia, did what most parents of afflicted children do. They read everything they could about their son's ailment. They learned that the only son of the last Tsar of Russia was a hemophiliac. And in Robert's book Nicholas and Alexandra, he speculated on whether the child's illness, the result of the random mating of the wrong sperm with the wrong egg, might have distracted and upset the royal parents and affected their ability to govern, bringing on the Bolshevik Revolution. He suggested that Europe's most populous nation may have changed its form of government, affecting the lives of everyone in the 20th century. Because of that random genetic occurrence, some people will find the hand of God behind everything that happens. I visit a woman in the hospital whose car was run into by a drunken driver running a red light. Her vehicle was totally demolished, but miraculously, she escaped with only 2 cracked ribs and a few superficial cuts from flying glass. She looks up at me from her hospital bed and says, "Now I know there is a God. If I could come out of that alive and in one piece, it must be because he is looking out for me up there." I smile and keep quiet, running the risk of letting her think that I agree with her. What rabbi would be opposed to belief in God, because it is not the time or place for a theology seminar? But my mind goes back to a funeral I conducted 2 weeks earlier, for a young husband and father who died in a similar drunk driver collision, and I remember another case, a child killed by a hit-and-run driver while roller skating, and all the newspaper accounts of lives cut short in automobile accidents. The woman before me may believe that she is alive because God wanted her to survive, and I am not inclined to talk her out of it, but what would she or I say to those other families? That they were less worthy than she, less valuable in God's sight? That God wanted them to die at that particular time and manner, and did not choose to spare them. Remember our discussion in Chapter 1 of Thornton Wilder's Bridge of San Luis Rey? When 5 people fall to their deaths, Brother Juniper investigates and learns that each of the 5 had recently put things together in his life. He is tempted to conclude that the rope bridges breaking was not an accident, but an aspect of God's providence. There are no accidents. But when laws of physics and metal fatigue cause a wing to fall off an airplane, or when human carelessness causes engine failure, so that a plane crashes, killing 200 people, was it God's will that those 200 should chance to be on a doomed plane that day? And if the 201st passenger had a flat tire on the way to the airport and missed the flight, grumbling and cursing his luck as he saw the plane take off without him, was it God's will that he should live while the others died? If it were, I would have to wonder about what kind of message God was sending us with his apparently arbitrary acts of condemning and saving. When Martin Luther King, Jr., was killed in April 1968, much was made of the fact that he had passed his peak as a black leader. Many alluded to the speech he gave the night before his death, in which he said that, like Moses, he had been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land, implying that, like Moses, he would die before he reached it. Rather than accept his death as a senseless tragedy, many, like Wilder's brother Juniper, saw evidence that God took Martin Luther King at just the right moment to spare him the agony of living out his years as a has-been, a rejected prophet. I could never accept that line of reasoning. I would like to think that God is concerned, not only with the ego of one black leader, but with the needs of tens of millions of black men, women, and children. It would be hard to explain in what way they were better off for Dr. King's having been murdered. Why can't we acknowledge that the assassination was an affront to God, even as it was to us, and a sidetracking of his purposes? Rather than strain our imaginations to find evidence of God's fingerprints on the murder weapon? Soldiers in combat fire their weapons at an anonymous, faceless enemy. They know that they cannot let themselves be distracted by thinking that the soldier on the other side may be a nice, decent person with a loving family and a promising career waiting at home. Soldiers understand that a speeding bullet has no conscience, that a falling mortar shell cannot discriminate between those whose death would be a tragedy and those who would never be missed. That is why soldiers develop a certain fatalism about their chances, speaking of the bullet with their name on it, of their number coming up, rather than calculating whether they deserve to die or not. That is why the army will not send the sole surviving son of a bereaved family into combat, because the army understands that it cannot rely on God to make things come out fairly, even as the Bible long ago ordered home from the army every man who had just betrothed a wife or built a new home, lest he die in battle and never come to enjoy them. The ancient Israelites, for all their profound faith in God, knew that they could not depend on God to impose a morally acceptable pattern on where the arrows landed. Let us ask again, is there always a reason, or do some things just happen at random, for no cause? In the beginning, the Bible tells us, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was formless and chaotic, with darkness covering everything. Then God began to work his creative magic on the chaos, sorting things out, imposing order where there had been randomness before. He separated the light from the darkness, the earth from the sky, the dry land from the sea. This is what it means to create, not to make something out of nothing, but to make order out of chaos. A creative scientist or historian does not make up facts but orders facts. He sees connections between them rather than seeing them as random data. A creative writer does not make up new words but arranges familiar words in patterns which say something fresh to us. So it was with God, fashioning a world whose overriding principle was orderliness, predictability, in place of the chaos with which he started. Regular sunrises and sunsets, regular tides, plants and animals that bore seeds inside them so that they could reproduce themselves, each after its own kind. By the end of the sixth day, God had finished the world he had set out to make, and on the seventh day he rested. But suppose God didn't quite finish by closing time on the afternoon of the sixth day? We know today that the world took billions of years to take shape, not 6 days. The creation story in Genesis is a very important one, and has much to say to us, but its 6-day time frame is not meant to be taken literally. Suppose that creation, the process of replacing chaos with order, were still going on. What would that mean? In the biblical metaphor of the 6 days of creation, we would find ourselves somewhere in the middle of Friday afternoon. Man was just created a few hours ago. The world is mostly an orderly, predictable place, showing ample evidence of God's thoroughness and handiwork, but pockets of chaos remain. Most of the time, the events of the universe follow firm natural laws. But every now and then, things happen not contrary to those laws of nature but outside them. Things happen which could just as easily have happened differently. Even as I write this, the newscasts carry reports of a massive hurricane in the Caribbean. Meteorologists are at a loss to predict whether it will spin out to sea or crash into populated areas of the Texas-Louisiana coastline. The biblical mind saw the earthquake that overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah as God's way of punishing the people of those cities for their depravities. Some medieval and Victorian thinkers saw the eruption of Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii as a way of putting an end to that society's immorality. Even today, the earthquakes in California are interpreted by some as God's way of expressing his displeasure with the alleged homosexual excesses of San Francisco or the heterosexual ones of Los Angeles. But most of us today see a hurricane, an earthquake, a volcano as having no conscience. I would not venture to predict the path of a hurricane, on the basis of which communities deserve to be lashed and which ones to be spared. A change of wind direction or the shifting of a tectonic plate can cause a hurricane or earthquake to move toward a populated area instead of out into an uninhabited stretch of land. Why? A random shift in weather patterns causes too much or too little rain over a farming area, and a year's harvest is destroyed. A drunken driver steers his car over the center line of the highway and collides with the green Chevrolet instead of the red Ford 50 feet farther away. An engine bolt breaks on flight 205 instead of on flight 209, inflicting tragedy on one random group of families rather than another. There is no message in all of that. There is no reason for those particular people to be afflicted rather than others. These events do not reflect God's choices. They happen at random, and randomness is another name for chaos, in those corners of the universe where God's creative light has not yet penetrated. And chaos is evil, not wrong, not malevolent, but evil. Nonetheless, because by causing tragedies at random, it prevents people from believing in God's goodness. I once asked a friend of mine, an accomplished physicist, whether from a scientific perspective the world was becoming a more orderly place, whether randomness was increasing or decreasing with time. He replied by citing the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy: every system left to itself will change in such a way as to approach equilibrium. He explained that this meant the world was changing in the direction of more randomness. Think of a group of marbles in a jar, carefully arranged by size and color. The more you shake the jar, the more that neat arrangement will give way to random distribution, until it will be only a coincidence to find one marble next to another of the same color. This, he said, is what is happening to the world. One hurricane might veer off to sea, sparing the coastal cities, but it would be a mistake to see any evidence of pattern or purpose to that. Over the course of time, some hurricanes will blow harmlessly out to sea, while others will head into populated areas and cause devastation. The longer you keep track of such things, the less of a pattern you will find. I told him that I had been hoping for a different answer. I had hoped for a scientific equivalent of the first chapter of the Bible, telling me that with every passing day the realm of chaos was diminishing, and more of the universe was yielding to the rule of order. He told me that if it made me feel any better, Albert Einstein had the same problem. Einstein was uncomfortable with quantum physics and tried for years to disprove it, because it based itself on the hypothesis of things happening at random. Einstein preferred to believe that God does not play dice with the cosmos. It may be that Einstein and the Book of Genesis are right. A system left to itself may evolve in the direction of randomness. On the other hand, our world may not be a system left to itself. There may in fact be a creative impulse acting on it, the Spirit of God hovering over the dark waters, operating over the course of millennia to bring order out of the chaos. It may yet come to pass that, as Friday afternoon of the world's evolution ticks toward the great Sabbath, which is the end of days, the impact of random evil will be diminished. Or it may be that God finished his work of creating eons ago, and left the rest to us. Residual chaos, chance, and mischance, things happening for no reason, will continue to be with us, the kind of evil that Milton Steinberg has called the still unremoved scaffolding of the edifice of God's creativity. In that case, we will simply have to learn to live with it, sustained and comforted by the knowledge that the earthquake and the accident, like the murder and the robbery, are not the will of God, but represent that aspect of reality which stands independent of his will, and which angers and saddens God. Or no exceptions for nice people. The story is told of the youngster who came home from Sunday school, having been taught the biblical story of the crossing of the Red Sea. His mother asked him what he had learned in class, and he told her, the Israelites got out of Egypt, but Pharaoh and his army chased after them. They got to the Red Sea and they couldn't cross it. The Egyptian army was getting closer. So Moses got on his walkie-talkie, the Israeli Air Force bombed the Egyptians, and the Israeli Navy built a pontoon bridge so the people could cross. The mother was shocked. Is that the way they taught you the story? Well, no, the boy admitted, but if I told it to you the way they told it to us, you'd never believe it. Centuries ago, people found reassuring proof of God in stories of miracles. They would tell of how God divided the sea to let the Israelites cross on dry land. They would recount stories about God sending rain in answer to a righteous person's prayer, or about rivers reversing their courses, and the sun moving backward in its flight. They would remember tales of Daniel emerging unhurt from the den of lions, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego surviving the fiery furnace. The point of all these stories was to prove that God cared about us so much that he was willing to suspend the laws of nature to support and protect those whom he favored. But we today are like the little boy in the Sunday school story. We are told those stories and we are skeptical. If anything, we find proof of God precisely in the fact that laws of nature do not change. God has given us a wonderful, precise, orderly world. One of the things that makes the world livable is the fact that the laws of nature are precise and reliable, and always work the same way. There is gravity, heavy objects always fall toward the earth, so a builder can build a house without having his materials float away. There is chemistry, mixing certain elements in certain proportions always yields the same result, so a doctor can prescribe medication and know what will happen. We can predict when the sun will rise and set on any given day. We can even predict when the moon will block the sun for certain areas, causing an eclipse. To the ancients, an eclipse was an unnatural event which they interpreted as God's way of warning them. To us, it is a perfectly natural event, a reminder of how precise a universe God has given us. Our human bodies are miracles, not because they defy laws of nature, but precisely because they obey them. Our digestive systems extract nutrients from food. Our skins help to regulate body temperature by perspiring. The pupils of our eyes expand and contract in response to light. Even when we get sick, our bodies have built-in defense mechanisms to fight the illness. All these wonderful things happen, usually without our being aware of them, in accordance with the most precise laws of nature. That, not the legendary splitting of the Red Sea, is the real miracle, but the unchanging character of these laws, which makes medicine and astronomy possible, also causes problems. Gravity makes objects fall. Sometimes they fall on people and hurt them. Sometimes gravity makes people fall off mountains and out of windows. Sometimes gravity makes people slip on ice or sink underwater. We could not live without gravity. But that means we have to live with the dangers it causes. Laws of nature treat everyone alike. They do not make exceptions for good people or for useful people. If a man enters a house where someone has a contagious disease, he runs the risk of catching that disease. It makes no difference why he is in the house. He may be a doctor or a burglar. Disease germs cannot tell the difference. If Lee Harvey Oswald fires a bullet at President John Kennedy, laws of nature take over from the moment that bullet is fired. Neither the course of the bullet nor the seriousness of the wound will be affected by questions of whether or not President Kennedy was a good person, or whether the world would be better off with him alive or dead. Laws of nature do not make exceptions for nice people. A bullet has no conscience, neither does a malignant tumor or an automobile gone out of control. That is why good people get sick and get hurt as much as anyone. No matter what stories we were taught about Daniel or Jonah in Sunday school, God does not reach down to interrupt the workings of laws of nature to protect the righteous from harm. This is a second area of our world which causes bad things to happen to good people, and God does not cause it and cannot stop it. And really, how could we live in this world if He did? Let us suppose, for purposes of argument, that God was determined not to let anything bad happen to a good and pious person. If an Oswald shoots at the president, no matter how carefully he aims, God will make the bullet miss. If a wing falls off Air Force One, God will make it land safely. Would this be a better world, if certain people were immune to laws of nature because God favored them, while the rest of us had to fend for ourselves? Let us suppose, again for purposes of argument, that I was one of those righteous people to whom God would not let anything bad happen, because I was an observant, charitable person with a young family, spending my life helping people. What would that mean? Would I be able to go out in my shirt sleeves in cold weather and not get sick, because God would prevent the workings of nature from doing me harm? Could I cross streets against the lights in the face of heavy traffic, and not be injured? Could I jump out of high windows when I was in too much of a hurry to wait for an elevator, and not hurt myself? A world in which good people suffer from the same natural dangers that others do causes problems. But a world in which good people were immune to those laws would cause even more problems. Insurance companies refer to earthquakes, hurricanes, and other natural disasters as acts of God. I consider that a case of using God's name in vain. I don't believe that an earthquake that kills thousands of innocent victims without reason is an act of God. It is an act of nature. Nature is morally blind, without values. It churns along, following its own laws, not caring who or what gets in the way. But God is not morally blind. I could not worship Him if I thought He was. God stands for justice, for fairness, for compassion. For me, the earthquake is not an act of God. The act of God is the courage of people to rebuild their lives after the earthquake, and the rush of others to help them in whatever way they can. If a bridge collapses, if a dam breaks, if a wing falls off an airplane and people die, I cannot see that as God's doing. I cannot believe that God wanted all those people to die at that moment, or that He wanted some of them to die and had no choice but to condemn the others along with them. I believe that these calamities are all acts of nature, and that there is no moral reason for those particular victims to be singled out for punishment. Perhaps, as human beings apply their God-given intelligence to the area of natural disasters, we will one day be able to understand the physical processes behind earthquakes, hurricanes, and metal fatigue, and learn how to anticipate them or even prevent them. When that happens, fewer innocent people will fall victim to these so-called acts of God. I don't know why one person gets sick, and another does not, but I can only assume that some natural laws which we don't understand are at work. I cannot believe that God sends illness to a specific person for a specific reason. I don't believe in a God who has a weekly quota of malignant tumors to distribute, and consults his computer to find out who deserves one most or who could handle it best. What did I do to deserve this, is an understandable outcry from a sick and suffering person, but it is really the wrong question. Being sick or being healthy is not a matter of what God decides that we deserve. The better question is, if this has happened to me, what do I do now, and who is there to help me do it? As we saw in the previous chapter, it becomes much easier to take God seriously as the source of moral values if we don't hold him responsible for all the unfair things that happen in the world. But perhaps we ought to phrase our question differently. Instead of asking why good people have to suffer from the same laws of nature that bad people do, let us ask why any people have to suffer at all. Why do people have to get sick? Why do they have to feel pain? Why do people die? If God was designing a world for our maximum benefit, why could he not create unchanging laws of nature which would not do harm to any of us? Good or bad? Good God, how much reverence can you have for a supreme being who finds it necessary to include tooth decay in his divine system of creation? Why in the world did he ever create pain? Pain. Lieutenant Shyaskov's wife pounced upon the word victoriously. Pain is a useful symptom. Pain is a warning to us of bodily dangers. And who created the dangers? Yossarian demanded. Why couldn't he have used a doorbell to notify us, or one of his celestial choirs? Or a system of blue and red neon tubes right in the middle of each person's forehead? People would certainly look silly walking around with red neon tubes in the middle of their foreheads. They certainly look beautiful now writhing in agony, don't they? Joseph Heller, Catch 22. Why do we feel pain? Approximately 1 out of every 400,000 babies born is fated to live a short, pitiful life which none of us would envy, a life in which he will frequently hurt himself, sometimes seriously, and not know it. That child has a rare genetic disease known as familial dysautonomia. He cannot feel pain. Such a child will cut himself, burn himself, fall down and break a bone, and never know that something is wrong. He will not complain of sore throats and stomach aches, and his parents will not know when he is sick until it is too late. Would any of us want to live like that, without feeling pain? It is an unpleasant but necessary part of being alive. Author Joseph Heller may have his hero Yossarian make fun of the argument, but in fact pain is nature's way of telling us that we are overexerting ourselves, that some part of our body is not functioning as it was meant to, or is being asked to do more than it was intended to. Think of the stories you have read of athletes prematurely ending their careers, sometimes even crippling themselves permanently, because they forced themselves to ignore pain or took drugs that would stop the hurting without affecting the reason for it. Think of the people who had to be rushed to the hospital on an emergency basis, because they ignored the warning signs of mild pain, thinking it would go away if they did. We feel pain when we strain our muscles beyond what they can take. We feel pain to make us jerk our hand away from something hot before it burns us seriously. We feel pain as a signal that something is wrong in that marvelously intricate machine, our body. We may mistakenly think of pain as one of God's ways of punishing us, perhaps remembering how one of our parents would slap us when we were children, perhaps believing that all unpleasant things that come our way are punishments. In fact, the word pain comes from the same Latin root pona as do the words punish and penalty. But pain does not represent God's punishing us. It represents nature's way of warning good and bad people alike that something is wrong. Life may be unpleasant because we are subject to pain. Someone has said that a man with a toothache walking through a forest can't appreciate the beauty of the forest because his tooth hurts him. But life would be dangerous, perhaps unlivable, if we could not feel pain. But that sort of pain, the broken bone, the hot stove, is still a response. At the animal level, animals feel that sort of pain even as we do. You don't need to have a soul to feel pain when something sharp is stuck into your flesh. There is another level of pain, however, which only human beings can feel. Only human beings can find meaning in their pain. Consider the following: scientists have found ways of measuring the intensity of the pain we feel. They can measure the fact that a migraine headache hurts more than a skinned knee. And they have determined that Two of the most painful things human beings can experience are giving birth and passing a kidney stone. From a purely physical point of view, these two events both hurt equally, and hardly anything hurts more. But from a human point of view, the two are so different. The pain of passing a kidney stone is simply pointless suffering, the result of a natural malfunction somewhere in our body. But the pain of giving birth is creative pain. It is pain that has meaning, pain that gives life, that leads to something. That is why the person who passes a kidney stone will usually say, "I'd give anything not to have to go through that again," but the woman who has given birth to a child, like the runner or mountain climber who has driven his body to reach a goal, can transcend her pain and contemplate repeating the experience. Pain is the price we pay for being alive. Dead cells are hair, our fingernails can't feel pain, they cannot feel anything. When we understand that, our question will change from, "Why do we have to feel pain?" to "What do we do with our pain so that it becomes meaningful and not just pointless empty suffering?" How can we turn all the painful experiences of our lives into birth pangs or into growing pains? We may not ever understand why we suffer or be able to control the forces that cause our suffering, but we can have a lot to say about what the suffering does to us, and what sort of people we become because of it. Pain makes some people bitter and envious. It makes others sensitive and compassionate. It is the result, not the cause, of pain that makes some experiences of pain meaningful and others empty and destructive. Why did God create a world in which there is sickness and disease? I don't know why people get sick, sometimes fatally. I know that sicknesses are caused by germs and viruses, or at least, I take that on faith, never having seen a germ or a virus, but trusting my doctors to be honorable people who would not mislead me. I suspect that people get sick when they are depressed, when they feel rejected and can't look forward to the immediate future. I know that people recover from illness faster when they know that people care about them and when they have something to look forward to. But I don't have a good answer to the question of why our bodies had to be made vulnerable to germs and viruses and malignant tumors in the first place. I understand that the cells of which our bodies are made are constantly dying and being replaced. That makes it possible for us to grow bigger, and to grow new skin to replace scraped and bruised skin. I understand that when foreign presences invade our body, we mobilize our defenses to fight them, and the mobilization often causes our body temperature to rise and makes us feverish. I understand that for our bones to be flexible enough and light enough for us to be able to walk, they have to be fragile enough to break under severe strain. For a young man to be paralyzed because of a spinal cord injury in an accident which was not his fault is indescribably tragic, but at least it follows laws of nature which make sense. As we have learned more about how the human body works, as we understand more of the natural laws built into the world, we have some answers. We have come to understand that we cannot indefinitely abuse our bodies and neglect our health without increasing the risk of something going wrong. Our bodies are too sensitive, they have to be, to do the things we call on them to do. The man who smokes 2 packs of cigarettes a day for 20 years and develops lung cancer faces problems which deserve our sympathy, but he has no grounds for asking, "How could God do this to me?" The person who weighs considerably more than he should, and whose heart has to pump blood through miles of additional fat cells and clogged arteries will have to pay the price for that additional strain on his system, and will have no grounds to complain to God. Neither, alas, will the doctor, the clergyman, or the politician who works long hours, 7-day week after 7-day week, in the noblest of causes, but fails to take care of his own health in the process. But why cancer? Why blindness and diabetes and hypertension and kidney failure? Why do things spontaneously go wrong in our bodies without our having caused them through bad health habits? To explain that, mental retardation results from a defective chromosome is to offer an explanation which does not really explain anything. Why should chromosomes become defective? And why should a person's potential for happiness in life depend on their not doing so? I have no satisfying answer to those questions. The best answer I know is The reminder that man today is only the latest stage in a long, slow evolutionary process. Once upon a time, the only living things in the world were plants. Then there were amphibian creatures, then came the higher, more complex animals, and finally man. As life evolved from the simpler to the more complex, we retained and inherited some of the weaknesses of those earlier forms. Like plants, our bodies remain vulnerable to injury and decay. Like animals, we can grow sick and die. But there are no tragedies when plants die, and animals have one important advantage over humans. If something goes wrong in an animal's body, if something breaks down, leaving the animal weak and crippled, that animal is less likely to mate and to pass on its defective genes to the next generation. In that way, traits less suited to survival fade out, and the next generation is likely to be bigger, stronger, and healthier. Human beings don't operate that way. A human being who is diabetic or has other inherited health problems, but is an attractive, sensitive person, will marry and have children. No one would deny him that right. But in the process, he will bring into the world children with a better than average chance of having something go wrong with their bodies. Consider the following sequence of events. In the delivery room, a baby is born with a congenital heart defect or some other serious ailment hidden in his parents' genetic background which threatens his survival. If he were to die shortly after birth, his parents would go home, saddened and depressed, wondering about what might have been. But then they would begin to make the effort to put the loss behind them and look to the future. But the child does not die. Through the miracles of modern medicine and heroic devotion of nurses and doctors, he survives. He grows up, too frail to take part in sports, but bright and cheerful and popular. He becomes a doctor, or a teacher, or a poet. He marries and has children. He is respected in his profession and well liked in his neighborhood. His family loves him. People learn to depend on him. Then, at age 35 or 40, his frail health catches up with him. His congenitally weak heart, which nearly failed him at birth, gives out and he dies. Now his death causes more than a few days of sadness. It is a shattering tragedy for his wife and children, and a profoundly saddening event for all the other people in his life. We could prevent many tragedies like that one, if we were to let sickly children die at birth, if we worked less diligently to help them survive childhood illnesses and hazards, if we permitted only the healthiest specimens to marry and have children, and forbade others to know those satisfactions. After all, that is what animals do, so that genetic errors are not passed on from generation to generation. But who among us, on moral grounds or simple self-interest, would agree to that? Even as I write these lines, I think of a young man in my community who is slowly dying of a degenerative disease, and I find myself wondering if all this biological speculation will be of any consolation to him. I suspect that it will not. Unless we want to play the role of Job's comforters, why should we find it helpful to know that his illness follows certain natural laws? Will it make him feel any better to be told that his parents unknowingly passed on to him the seeds of his terrible illness? Job asked questions about God, but he did not need lessons in theology. He needed sympathy and compassion and the reassurance that he was a good person and a cherished friend. My neighbor asks me questions about his illness, but we misunderstand his needs if we respond with lessons in biology and genetics. Like Job, he needs to be told that what is happening to him is dreadfully unfair. He needs help in keeping his mind and spirit strong, so that he can look forward to a future in which he will be able to think and plan and decide, even if he can't walk or swim, and will not have to become a helpless, dependent cripple even if he loses certain skills. I don't know why my friend and neighbor is sick and dying and in constant pain. From my religious perspective, I cannot tell him that God has his reasons for sending him this terrible fate, or that God must specially love him or admire his bravery to test him in this way. I can only tell him that the God I believe in did not send the disease and does not have a miraculous cure that he is withholding. But in a world in which we all possess immortal spirits in fragile and vulnerable bodies, the God I believe in gives strength and courage to those who, unfairly and through no fault of their own, suffer pain and the fear of death. I can help him remember that he is more than a crippled body. He is more than a man with a debilitating illness. He is a man with a loving wife and children, with many friends, and with enough iron in his soul to remain a living person in the fullest sense of the word until the very last day. I don't know why people are mortal and fated to die, and I don't know why people die at the time and in the way they do. Perhaps we can try to understand it by picturing what the world would be like if people lived forever. When I was a freshman in college, I was a young man for whom old age and death were so remote that I never thought about them. But one of my freshman courses was in the classics of world literature, and I read two discussions of death and immortality which so impressed me that they have remained with me today, 30 years later. In Homer's Odyssey, there is a passage in which Ulysses meets Calypso, a sea princess and a child of the gods. Calypso, a divine being, is immortal. She will never die. She is fascinated by Ulysses, never having met a mortal before. As we read on, we come to realize that Calypso envies Ulysses because he will not live forever. His life becomes more full of meaning, his every decision is more significant, precisely because his time is limited, and what he chooses to do with it represents a real choice. Later that year I read Swift's Gulliver's Travels. In the land of the Lugnagins, Swift writes in his fantasy, it happened once or twice in a generation that a child was born with a circular red spot on its forehead, signifying that it would never die. Gulliver imagines those children to be the most fortunate people imaginable, being born exempt from that universal calamity of human nature, death. But as he comes to meet them, he realizes that they are in fact the most miserable and pitiable of creatures. They grow old and feeble. Their friends and contemporaries die off. At the age of 80, their property is taken from them and given to their children, who would otherwise never inherit from them. Their bodies contract various ailments, they accumulate grudges and grievances, they grow weary of the struggle of life, and they can never look forward to being released from the pain of living. Homer shows us an immortal being envying us for being mortal. Swift teaches us to pity the person who cannot die. He wants us to realize that living with the knowledge that we will die may be frightening and tragic. But knowing we will never die would be unbearable. We might wish for a longer life, or a happier one, but how could any of us endure a life that went on forever? For many of us, we will come to the point where death will be the only healer for the pain which our lives will have come to contain. If people lived forever and never died, one of two things would have to happen. Either the world would become impossibly crowded, or else people would avoid having children to avoid that crowding. Humanity would be deprived of that sense of a fresh start, that potential for something new under the sun, which the birth of a child represents. In a world where people lived forever, we would probably never have been born. But, as in our previous discussion of pain, we have to acknowledge that it is one thing to explain that mortality in general is good for people in general. It is something else again to try to tell someone who has lost a parent, a wife, or a child, that death is good. We don't dare try to do that. It would be cruel and thoughtless. All we can say to someone at a time like that is that vulnerability to death is one of the given conditions of life. We can't explain it any more than we can explain life itself. We can't control it, or sometimes even postpone it. All we can do is try to rise beyond the question, why did it happen, and begin to ask